Here's a little comic that shows a daisy talking to her child, and it says, "No, you may not be excused. You're not leaving this dinner table until you're finished photosynthesizing." So it's just a silly comic to get us thinking about how this photosynthesis process is essentially the food or the dinner of these plants. In fact, plants need a few simple ingredients to make their own food. They need sunlight, they need carbon dioxide gas, and they need water. Consider this. A small acorn grows into a giant oak tree. Acorns are types of dry fruits. They're actually classified as a type of nut. And an acorn is a living thing. It contains a seed, and inside that seed contains a baby plant in the form of a plant embryo. And that plant embryo can divide its cells and eventually grow into this giant tree. But the question you want to consider now is, where did all that weight come from? That is to say, where did all this dry biomass come from, or that woody tissue? To help us think about this, let's get some historical perspective and consider this guy, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont. You can see his name on the screen there. He was a Belgian scientist hundreds of years ago. He did these experiments in the early 1600s. His hypothesis was that as plants grow up, they get their weight from either water or from particles in the soil. He had a very simple experiment in which he weighed out the soil for a pot and he weighed a baby tree. He only gave the baby tree water and, of course, sunlight. And after the tree grew up, he weighed both the tree and the soil to see if there was any change in the weight of the tree versus the soil. Again, only water is given and, of course, sunlight. The tree was placed outdoors where it got good sun. Here's his results presented in the form of a table. At the beginning, the tree was about 5 pounds, and 5 years later, the tree was about 170 pounds. The soil didn't change barely at all. The soil started at 199.8 pounds, and 5 years later, it weighed 199.6 pounds. So a very small change in weight of soil compared to that of the tree. So in his results, he said, therefore, 164 pounds of wood, bark, and root had arisen from the water alone. So let's reflect on this for a moment. I'd like you to make sure that you can describe his experiment, and also I'd like you to consider, what about this conclusion would you agree with, and what about this conclusion would you disagree with? So here's another perspective. I'd like you to click on this link or enter this link into your browser, and that way you can listen to this Lessons from Thin Air movie. And you can hear what the Harvard graduates thought when they were asked this very same question. Where does all that dry biomass come from? Well, we've seen a few different perspectives now about where the tree's weight comes from. You might have your initial ideas about where the tree's weight comes from. Classmates, if you have a chance to talk to someone, they might have ideas. Van Helmont said water. If you get a chance to watch the Harvard graduates, you'll see they have lots of ideas, including soil, water, and sun. But all of these people are actually incorrect. All of the tree's weight ultimately comes from carbon dioxide, specifically the carbon in carbon dioxide. We think of this carbon dioxide gas as being something that doesn't exist, something around us we can't see, we can't picture what it looks like, but nonetheless, carbon dioxide gas has mass, and carbon dioxide gas can be used to build those sugars in plants. Now, to help us understand how this works, let's take a look at this figure from our textbook. It shows us the equation of photosynthesis, which includes carbon dioxide, water, and light energy being the inputs of photosynthesis, and a glucose molecule and oxygen being the outputs of photosynthesis. Today, we're going to learn how plants can use these simple ingredients to make sugars, such as a glucose. We've seen this figure before, back in chapter 4. Recall that these processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are linked together in an ecosystem. Without photosynthesis, neither the plants nor the animal in this image would survive. Photosynthesis is therefore essential to sustaining life on Earth as we know it. All right, here's a challenge question for you. Evolution favored the development of photosynthesis because photosynthetic organisms, your first choice is produce oxygen, your next choice is make their own food, your next choice is make food for heterotrophs, your next choice is use carbon dioxide, and your final choices, all of these choices are actually correct. Pause the lecture if you don't want to hear the answer yet. B is the only answer. Make their own food is key, because if you can make your own food, then you're not dependent on getting your food from other sources. When you're studying for the exam, make certain that you understand why photosynthesis is essential to life on our planet. So before we talk about the details for how photosynthesis works, we need to understand a little bit about the energy source for photosynthesis, which is light from the sun. Here we can see the sunlight that reaches the Earth is mostly going to be in the form of this ultraviolet radiation. Shorter wavelengths have higher energy than longer wavelengths within this ultraviolet radiation spectrum. The only wavelengths of light that are visible to us humans are the colors of the rainbow, which are the colors of this ultraviolet radiation spectrum. Plant pigments are able to capture this visible light and use it as an energy source for the photosynthetic reaction. In this diagram from your textbook, it shows us how different pigments have relatively different ways in which they can absorb wavelengths of light. That is to say, by having multiple pigments, we can absorb multiple colors from this ultraviolet radiation spectrum. However, notice no pigment absorbs green light. That is why most plants appear as green, because that green light is reflected, and so the human eye perceives those leaves to appear as green. All right, let's make sure we understand this. Why are leaves green? The first choice is heterotrophs see green better than any other color. The next choice is plant pigments absorb green light. The next choice is plant pigments absorb almost every wavelength except for green. And the final choice is plant pigments change yellow light that they absorb to green light that we see. Pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer. This is the right answer. Plant pigments absorb almost every wavelength except for green. Why are chloroplasts, those organelles that we find in plant cells, the key to photosynthesis? Gas exchange occurs at leaf pores called stomata. We can think of a single stoma as being this little hole or this little opening found on the surface of the leaf. Each leaf also contains many types of specialized cells called mesophyll cells, and you can see the spelling of this word on your screen. This mesophyll is very important because it is where the photosynthesis is going to be occurring the most in our leaf. Each mesophyll cell contains several chloroplasts. And remember, chloroplasts are those organelles that are the site of photosynthesis. But it's specifically the chlorophyll that's found in the chloroplast where this photosynthesis occurs. The chloroplast contains several stacks of thylakoid membranes, which we refer to as the grana. So here on the screen, we can see a single granum, or we can talk about a single stack or all the stacks as being multiple grana. So it's a singular version of the word granum versus the plural version of the word grana. The pigment molecules themselves are found on the thylakoid membrane. And it's truly these pigment molecules that do this business of capturing light from the sun. A photosystem is a large protein structure that's found embedded in this thylakoid membrane. And these photosystems look like these huge masses of proteins because they are these huge masses of proteins. Where else have we seen these proteins embedded in membranes? Well, remember the electron transport chain that we've talked about? This is very similar in that it is a series of proteins embedded in this membrane that is found inside our chloroplast. Pigment molecules such as chlorophyll, but also other pigment molecules, can be found embedded within these photosystems. And here on the screen we can see the chemical formula of the chlorophyll. And notice this, it has that long hydrophobic tail. We've seen this word hydrophobic tail. Remember the phospholipid bilayer? That also has a hydrophobic tail. Alright, let's see if we understand the anatomy of these cells now. Of the following list of structures, which one is the second smallest? So not the absolute smallest, but one that is the second smallest. And your choices are chloroplast, granum, mesophyll cell, leaf, and finally thylakoid. Pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer. Granum is the answer. Because which one is the smallest in this list? The smallest is the thylakoid. That is that little green disc. The stacks of green discs are referred to as the grana. The grana are found in a chloroplast. The chloroplast is found in a mesophyll cell, and the mesophyll cells are found in a leaf. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you can describe the relationship among the chloroplast, the stroma, which is that fluid found between the grana, and the thylakoids. Now that we know where photosynthesis occurs, let's look at some of the details about how it happens. Today's big learning goals are as follows. First, understand the roles of carbon dioxide, water, and light in the photosynthetic reaction. And next, for both of the stages of photosynthesis, we want to describe the goal of the reaction, how it happens, and where each occurs. And we're going to learn in detail the two main stages of photosynthesis include the light reactions and the carbon reactions. Photosynthesis occurs in two stages, and we can see them related to each other in this picture of a chloroplast. It shows us the light reactions occurring on these little green stacks, and the carbon reactions occurring in this liquid around the green stacks. First, let's talk about the light reactions. The light reactions occur in the thylakoids and require both water and light. That is to say, without presence of water and light, these light reactions will not occur. The main products of the light reactions include ATP and NADPH, and we can see these are abbreviations for molecules that are on your screen here. We don't need to know the long fancy name for this. We can just say ATP and NADPH. Also note that oxygen gas is actually a waste product of the light reactions. Now, it's important to note that this oxygen is essential for life as we know it. All organisms need this oxygen, but it was really a happy accident of evolution because this oxygen is not required for this light reaction to occur. Now, let's zoom in on these thylakoid membranes to see the chemical reactions that are actually happening there. Step 1 of the light reactions, let's look at the goal. The overall goal is to trap the sun's energy and store this energy as chemical energy. The plant can use sunlight and enzymes to split a water molecule. In doing so, in splitting this water molecule, oxygen gas is released. And here is that waste product. That oxygen gas is produced right away in the first step of the light reactions. If we look at a picture of this chloroplast, we can see light is striking it and these thylakoid membranes are absorbing the light. How does this occur? It's the chlorophyll and other photosynthetic pigments that do this business of absorbing visible light. Specifically, these pigments transfer energy to what we call a reaction center. So here's the fancy word for these rays of light. They're called photons. And those photons strike pigment molecules where that energy is ultimately passed to this reaction center. There are two important things to understand when we think about photons of light striking these pigment molecules. And I will say that this diagram on your screen is from a different textbook. I wanted to bring in some other types of visual aids that you can use to help you understand how these reactions occur. The first thing to understand about when photons of light strike a chloroplast is that first, these photons of light excite chlorophyll to release electrons. These electrons then can go to a primary electron acceptor, as you can see here on your screen. At the same time, these photons of light cause an enzyme. Remember, enzymes are types of proteins that make sure that cells can get work done. This photon of light causes an enzyme to split water, thus replenishing the electrons that were lost from the reaction center. This is very important to understand. If it wasn't for this enzyme splitting water, we would not replace the electrons that were lost and the whole reaction would shut down. All of this is occurring right here. We can see there's a big star here. It's called the water splitting photosystem. The important products of this light reaction involves first ATP. Now we're looking here by the electron transport chain part of this process. ATP is produced as part of this electron transport chain. As electrons are passed from protein to protein in an organized way, it allows this cell to make ATP that can be used to do cell work. And second, NADPH is going to be produced. specifically because we're going to take NADP plus and we're going to load electrons into this electron carrier molecule. And all of this is occurring at a NADPH producing photosystem. So it's another reaction center where now we can take these electrons and load them into this electron carrier molecule. It's very important to understand that at the end of these light reactions, all we have is energy that we can use to get work done in the next stage. All we have is a bunch of ATP, which we learned a lot about in Chapter 4, and we have NADPH, which is an electron carrier molecule fully loaded with electrons. We still haven't made any wood or bark or roots. And also, we still haven't used any carbon dioxide. Now, I do want to show you the textbook as well, because this is what the Learn Smart Study module is going to use when it quizzes you about these parts of this metabolism. Now, the fancy word for this first photosystem is called photosystem 2. And you can see here it involves these steps. First, ejected electrons move down an electron transport chain. That causes protons, which are designated by H+, to be pumped into the thylakoid. These protons leave through ATP synthase, which is a little machine that produces the ATP. Photosystem 1 does the business of producing the NADPH. The steps of photosystem 1 include first, electrons reach the photosystem because they were delivered there after they moved in an organized way from protein to protein down an electron transport chain. Energy from light again ejects electrons into a transport chain, and these electrons can be used to reduce our NADP plus to NADPH, which is to say we are going to load electrons into our NADPH. Now you'll notice in the first diagram we looked at, I referred to photosystem 2 as the water-splitting photosystem, and photosystem 1 as the NADPH-producing photosystem. So we can use both of these terms interchangeably with photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Now we're ready to talk about the carbon reaction. The carbon reactions occur in the stroma of our chloroplast. And remember, stroma is that fluid matrix that we find around those thylakoid membranes. Carbon reactions use carbon dioxide and ultimately produce sugars. In the carbon reactions, the chloroplast will use the ATP and the NADPH that was produced in the light reactions. The carbon reactions are also referred to as the Calvin cycle, and the carbon reactions are light independent. That is to say, the carbon reactions do not require light. The carbon reactions occur day and night, 24 hours a day in the plant cell. The goal of the carbon reactions is to take the energy stored in ATP and NADPH and then store that energy in sugars that are built from the carbon in carbon dioxide. We can finally use carbon dioxide, which diffuses in the leaves from the air outside in the atmosphere. ATP and NADPH can contribute their stored energy, allowing us to build our glucose. Remember, glucose is represented by C6H12O6. And this glucose can now be used to build our tree. The carbon reactions, as I mentioned, occur in the stroma, and we've boiled this down into 3 phases of the carbon reactions. And again, I pull in another diagram from a different textbook just to give you another way to understand how this works from another author's perspective. The first phase is called fixation. During fixation, RUBP, which you can see the abbreviation here, is a 5-carbon sugar. And that 5-carbon sugar is going to get fixed to a carbon dioxide. But it's not just 1-to-1. You can see it's 3-to-3. We're going to reorganize these molecules and reorganize these carbons in order to build an intermediate product. It's all about energy transformations as we go from carbon dioxide to sugar. 2 is reduction, and it's reduction of these intermediate products that actually results in a sugar being produced. And then finally, the third phase is regeneration. During regeneration, the cell is able to get back RUBP. It's able to build more of these 5-carbon sugars so that the cycle can continue more or less indefinitely. The cycle can continue as long as there's enough carbon dioxide present and as long as there's enough ATP and NADPH present. Because notice we have our inputs of lots of ATP and lots of electron carrier molecules, and the outputs are ADP and NADP+. So we can simply add a phosphate to ADP to build more ATP, and we can load electrons into our electron carrier molecule. It's really nice how from these reactions it gives us the opportunity to build more raw materials so that we can keep doing this over and over, making these glucoses and other organic compounds. Let's make sure we understand this. How does a plant cell use the ATP that it produces in these light reactions? Your first choice is to fuel processes and reactions throughout the cell. Your next choice is to fuel the carbon reactions. Your next choice is to break down glucose. And your final choice is to convert NADP+ to NADPH. Pause the lecture if you don't want to see the answer yet. The answer is to fuel the carbon reactions. When you're studying for the exam, make certain you understand the roles of carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH in the Kelvin cycle. Plants use glucose for energy and to build larger polysaccharides. Remember that glucose is a monomer, and if we link up these monomers, we can grow complex polymers. And one of these polymers is cellulose, the main component of plant cell walls. Another polymer is starch, which is where we can store lots of energy in our plant cells. All right, we now have accomplished all of today's learning goals. We understand the roles of carbon dioxide, water, and light in the photosynthetic reaction. For the light reactions, we know the goal, the how, and the where. And for the carbon reactions, we now know the goal, the how, and the where as well. Putting it all together, ultimately, we can build a tree from air. By all of these complex metabolic reactions, we can take the carbon and carbon dioxide, pack those carbons together to build sugars and cell walls in our plants. Your final question is this. The majority of actual weight, which is to say dry biomass, gained by plants as they progress from seed to adult, comes from which of the following substances? Particle substances in the soil that are taken up by plant roots. Molecules in the air that enter through holes in the plant leaves. Substances dissolved in water taken up directly by plant roots, or energy from the sun. You've got 4 choices. This is a big question, so please pause the lecture so you can consider this answer carefully. The only correct answer is molecules in the air. The majority of the actual weight simply comes from carbon dioxide gas. That carbon and carbon dioxide contributes most of that biomass in a living plant. And a final reflection for you. Consider this. Your friend tells you that plants are good because they take carbon dioxide and they convert it directly into oxygen. So your challenge is, how could you agree with this statement? Is there any part of this statement that you agree with? And then also, what about this statement do you disagree with? You absolutely want to make sure that you can answer this question by supporting your answer with evidence